Josh Patterson, thanks for being here.
Yeah, man. Thanks for giving in to my, I don't know, what's the word? Being self-centered.
Offering yourself up
offering
to the listeners.
Arrogantly offering my services.
No, I'm going to get to that. So we've been friends for 4 years and change. I've been a guest on your podcast, Rethinking Faith, a number of times. You are heavily involved in Theology Beer Camp, which I've been to the last 2 years with your permission. So people might have heard your name, kind of seen your show around. But specifically, you wanted to be here today. So I started doing these Still Christian episodes where I do a lot of stuff about people having left the faith, for those I don't believe in that God episodes. That's often people who no longer identify as Christian. And then I do the worries about progressive Christianity and stuff like that episodes, which are people to my right who are definitely Christian. But I've been kind of throwing in this third one more recently of like people who have remained Christian despite a lot of their friends and people in their circles having left it behind. And that's true of me. It's true of a good number of my personal friends. And once I started doing these, you reached out and said, "Hey, I want to do one of those. I want to do one of the Still Christians." So tell us why.
I was excited when I saw that you started doing that idea. And I mean, really, part of my motivation was selfish. Not selfish in the sense of like, okay, let me go, talk on Dan's show, but selfish in the sense that that question is intriguing to me. And I figured that if I could have the conversation with you, I would actually be able to flesh that out a little bit. Like, it's a live question for me. I want to know why I'm still a Christian. And I was like, oh, well, let's go talk to the psychologist who actually knows about theology stuff, and I'm sure he could help me figure it out.
Psychologist in training, technically, but yes. Point taken. Okay, so as opposed to you had an answer for this question that you thought would be really compelling, you actually want to find the answer in real time with my help. Is that what we're doing here today?
To an extent, yes. I mean, I have reasons why I think Christianity is still compelling to me, but there's definitely also other reasons to not think it is.
Well, let's start with that whole live question thing. So you're saying like this is a live question. It's something that you are still kind of thinking about, even though you would say you're a Christian right now. It's like, there are like question marks around the edges. That's kind of what I take you to mean. So if that's the case, why? What's live about it versus what's settled, Yeah,
well, I think the live question has to do with just how my relationship to something like faith or religion has continued to shift and change over time. Like when we first met, I was still a pastor, and reading tons of theology all the time, these kind of things. Currently, I am no longer in vocational ministry. I mean, I work as a parish administrator part-time for an Episcopal church, but I'm not serving like a pastoral role.
Yeah, that's a big ministry change for you from what you were doing before to what you're doing now, for sure.
Yeah, and I did like 3 years of brewing in between there. So
brewing beer. Which is why you're such a good fit for Theology Beer Camp. We should say.
Exactly. See that cool beer label right there? Process Party.
Yeah, if people are watching on video, they can see that was a very good beer, by the way. I had you mail me a 6-pack of that so that I could enjoy it at home, and very good. Yep.
Sweet. Well, so that shift did something. And then also just recently I've noticed that I've been having this experience where people ask me more theology-related questions, and I'm having a harder time articulating answers to them. Now,
like your view, your particular view on these questions, or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Like I was invited to do a podcast called like Life with Jesus or something like that recently, and when asked to talk about Jesus, I stumbled a bit, and it was like weird to me. And I don't want you to think, though, that I'm like reducing the Christian faith to a set of like, doctrines or like mental assents or propositions or something like that.
Yeah.
But I've just noticed that language that I used to be comfortable with is like odd, or I'm trying to grasp for something and not really able to cling on to something. It's like
maybe
weird
we
time.
let's do two birds with one stone there. So we can get a little bit of your background, I think, by talking about what's some of that language, like what are some specifics there that are, that used to be a really comfortable terminology for me, and now I'm kind of balking at using those kind of words or whatever.
Yeah, so like the one that really messed me up was like, she asked me like, oh, so tell listeners about your personal relationship with Jesus. And I don't know that I ever had a good answer to that question.
Yeah.
But I had less of one. I just stumbled over my words, and instead of like being able to articulate something that felt embodied and pragmatic, I felt myself just going to the abstract, like wanting to go to the philosophy, not necessarily the theology. Does that make sense?
Well, I would think when people talk about personal relationship with Jesus, I mean, obviously that term takes me back to evangelicalism, right? Just a very important term in that world. But I would think that people more mean experiential than they mean theological, like sort of like, how do you, I would assume that people are asking about my prayer practices, maybe my scripture reading, or like my felt sense of God, like any sort of communication between myself and God as I would perceive it. That's what I would assume someone meant when they asked that question. And you didn't go that direction. You didn't really go the kind of personal, experiential direction, it sounds like.
Yeah, which is strange for me because part of what has been so helpful and life-giving to me in my, air quotes deconstruction type thing has been the contemplative practice and the mystics and this kind of thing.
Right.
And recently I have found myself more averse to those kind of practices. Like I haven't been doing them. And there's almost like some kind of trepidation around trying that again. And it's been I've found myself more caught up in the weeds philosophically and asking like big metaphysical questions that the kind of like theological, implications of those things, or even just the embodied like experience of doing centering prayer, like hasn't been present in my life, which I guess leads to some of that, like why I went for the more abstract rather than the embodied, like here's how I've been praying kind of thing.
Let me ask you if you had this kind of an experience, because this is certainly what I will usually feel if someone asks me a question like that. Like the evangelical version of is like, how's your walk, or how are your quiet times?
Right.
Most people in my life don't ask me questions like that anymore. I think they've kind of self-filtered out of my life, if that's kind of the way that they do Christian business. But even anything that is kind of hinting at or seems like it includes practices, prayer practices, anything like that, I feel where it kind of pings for me in my historical memory is like, oh, I'm on the spot here. Someone's like trying to figure out if I'm doing this good enough. Like I got to show receipts for my
Right.
my walk, and it's kind of like an uncomfortable, like somebody like checking in on you in an annoying way. Like if a teacher is like unnecessarily bugging you while you're working on a group presentation, or something like that.
Right.
And so I just I get that kind of natural reaction to a question like that. Was that a part of your experience?
Yeah, I mean, maybe to an extent, but what's interesting though, as you were saying that, and I was thinking, the person asking the question wasn't the one that was kind of putting that pressure on me. I think it was more internal. I think like I was feeling the sense of having some kind of good answer from like a perceived, like pressure from within. Not because this lady's podcast is like very, I I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but like more like woo woo, spiritual, like
not
she's
an
into,
evangelical kind of a
Course in Miracles
situation.
kind of thing. Yeah.
Oh, okay, interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So like, definitely no judgment coming from her.
Right.
So
okay.
perhaps just maybe perceived pressure, like, oh, I don't even know.
Well, I mean, like, do you feel a sense of guilt for having dropped off your centering prayer practices and stuff like that? Do you feel just confusion, or is it just kind of unclear what's going on? Like, how would you describe that?
Yeah, I would say unclear. Not so much guilt. Just unclear as to why and like what the aversion to doing it again is.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, I know, I mean, I think I can say this, we can always cut it out if you don't feel comfortable, but, we've chatted about some of your experiences, and I've been one of the friends that you have kind of ran things by. You
absolutely.
tend to run ideas by me, you'll run experiences by me and be like, hey, have you ever experienced anything like this? Do you have any kind of thoughts about that? And, my kind of basic sense is that those have been pretty important for you. I mean, they've been oftentimes quite centering. They have at many times kind of given you, I don't know, a sense of confidence that there is some reality here that you are involved in some way. Has that confidence changed? Do you still feel like that's what those experiences say? You know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely still, when I think back to them and remember them, it definitely is a positive experience for me. And I do think they have explanatory power as to why I might still say something like, oh, I think there is a God that is no less than personal, to like steal language from Phil Clayton.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I use that line. Yeah. Or I say no less than a mind or whatever. Yeah. It's similar.
Yeah. No less than a mind, no less than personal. I like the personal language just because I'm like big on the whole love thing,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, so I think it helps with some explanatory power in that regard. But also, yeah, I don't know. It's just, it feels less, I don't want to say less real, but that might be part of it. Like, but that also comes from the lack of practice, right? The lack of putting myself in that space. Because also, like, as we're talking, I think part of it too is I haven't been in like a faith community for a long time. I work that church that I work in. I don't attend there. I went to a service the other day and actually really loved it. It was beautiful, and I felt moved. I felt the presence of Christ, if you want to use that kind of language. And like that was kind of reassuring. But I wonder if part of the separation from community and practice is really giving into this, like, you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, it wouldn't shock me at all, because, the sort of less often we do something, the less at the center of our attention it is. Kind of even our recall, we will think to compare other experiences to it less because it's less top of mind. I know for me, like, my contemplative practice has dipped way down since having kids. And
that makes sense.
Some people, I know that there are people who are able to kind of work around that and figure out a way to prioritize that experience. And those people are better practitioners than I am. I have not really, not in general, not succeeded at that. And maybe not tried very hard either. And, in some ways, I think some of that has been replaced by my experience of my children, that there is something mindful. There's something kind of like being on holy ground. There's something really joyful, and I think maybe a little bit transcendent. That might be too strong of a term with some of these interactions with my boys, and yet I do kind of notice, like I've noticed over the last 4 years or so, that I don't go to that place as often. In fact, I'll give you an example from this morning. Often what I'll do in the morning is I'll watch both boys. So almost a 4-year-old and then a 2-month-old. And, I'm holding the 2-month-old. He's been kind of crying. He has like tummy troubles, like digestion stuff, kind of regularly. And then he's quiet, and inexplicably, our almost 4-year-old is totally silent for about 90 seconds, which never happens. And I was like, oh my goodness, it's so quiet right now. And it like thrust itself upon me, that realization, because it's so rare, especially in the mornings. I do this basically every morning now. And I just kind of sat in it, and I was just like soaking it up. And I was like, man, I miss this stuff. I miss setting aside time by myself to be totally quiet. And it did sort of like reinvigorate at least my, I don't know, curiosity and kind of getting back into a little bit of that, even if it's for shorter periods and a little bit less involved. But that's been further from my practice, and therefore it's further from my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I don't have kids, and also I get like super excited whenever I hear like you tell stories of your kids, or when I talk to mutual friend Trip, and like Trip is talking about like crazy things his kids are doing or whatever. That, I don't know, that's just something I like really look forward to in the future, is the potentiality of having kids. But those little moments, so I don't have that in the sense of like with the kids, but I've noticed myself more recently, this is a newer development, I catch myself praying before I go to sleep, which I like hadn't done in a really long time.
Yeah.
And I remember like as a teenager, I would like fervently, like youth group kid, read my Bible before bed. I kept it under my pillow, and then like do my prayers and go to sleep kind of thing. I haven't done anything like that in forever.
Yeah.
But I've found myself in moments like just of gratitude is really what it's been, is these like short, like I'm starting to fall asleep, and then I catch myself praying and just being like thankful for, the day, or for my wife that's sleeping next to me, or all these kind of things, so like there is I don't know, I can relate in the sense that those little moments do feel really good and refreshing, and it does kind of give me the like, hey, you should try this prayer thing again, because maybe it's actually helpful.
Yeah, I mean, do you think that you have started to do those practices less because they stopped being as powerful, helpful, whatever, or do you think it's other reasons?
I think it's other reasons. I think it came down to just like a time thing. Like when I was brewing, when I was at Full Tilt, I was often there until like pretty late, and that meant that I was also consuming alcohol pretty late on most days during the week. And
mornings then, not your brightest time. Yeah.
Right. And so, and like I always try to read in the morning. Like that's my practice, is I wake up intentionally like and give myself like an hour to read each morning. But yeah, so I think time was a part of it. And then I even think to an extent there, like you become influenced by the people you hang out and hang around.
Sure.
And like in the brewing world, like a bunch of my friends, I wasn't hanging out with like Christians anymore or something like that, or even people who have some kind of deep sense of spirituality. And so when like the people you're with all the time, you don't think about theology, they don't talk about that kind of stuff, it just kind of, it loses space. It doesn't take up as much space in your mind in your daily life, if that makes sense.
Okay, so this brings up a question for me. You've talked about sort of practices, contemplative practices, prayer, reading, habits on the one hand, and then you've mentioned theology a couple times now as well. For you, what's the relationship between theology as a endeavor of sort of abstract principles about God and faith and the world, and then the sort of rubber meeting the road with these practical, exercises, experiences, practices?
Yeah, I think for me I guess the practices is where the theology becomes real. It becomes actualized. Because I can sit and like I don't know, you could be an atheist and you could sit down and you could develop a really good theology, right? And not believe any of it. You could be an atheist and describe a very strong, say like systematic Calvinist theology and like put it together as an intellectual exercise and not
Right.
have to believe any of it. And so the experience part, the expression part is I think where that the abstract becomes actualized, it becomes real, it becomes like a lived into practice, which I think actually the more like I was about to say the older that I get, which is funny because I'm like 30 years old. But as I continue to
No, you are getting older. That's true.
yeah, as I not as old as some people, but as I continue to grow in wisdom and maturity, hopefully, I see the wisdom in that lived embodied experience rather than just an assent to a list of propositions.
Yeah.
Like they're becoming less important.
I wonder if that's a part of it. Like, I wonder if theological ideas becoming less important for you is having almost like a knock-on effect or almost like a delayed effect on your spiritual practice. Like, I wonder if in previous eras in your life, they were more closely linked. And as they become a bit decoupled, do you have to find different motivations for the practice? Do you have to find different words to describe what just happened in the practice and therefore like almost creating new meanings for them? Does that sound right?
Yeah, I mean that does seem to make sense. Yeah, I would think so. Especially too, because the kind of theological questions that I used to spend time asking a lot, right? And you could probably list these based off the conversations we've had, but like hell and atonement, right? And like Christology, these kind of things. I just have like the kind of questions I've been interested in more recently aren't that.
Right.
Like I've been at like the very base, like trying to figure out like basically metaphysics, like the how do things work? So I've been at like, if you want to talk about like again the deconstruction thing, I feel like I'm at the base of something, figuring that out, which will then hopefully allow me to do something constructive out of that, or at least that's what I'm searching to do. And so without those kind of theological questions at the helm, constantly driving and pointing to like, well, what is like Jesus's relation to hell and to, atonement and to Christology and to, whatever, ecclesiology, eschatology, then that hasn't been the focus as much. It's like more these abstract ideas of like, what the fuck is a concrescence and how does prehension work? Like, so that's such a different mind space to be in. And so, yeah, I think that it does kind of lend to that separation. They're not as obviously linked, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that does make sense. I'm thinking about, I don't have a very good formulation here, but something about the way that when you deconstruct, if you are basically hemmed into a corner where you have to rethink things the way that you and I each were by our personalities and experiences and all of that stuff. So you kind of put in that spot where you got to kind of rework it. I'm just wondering, I'm just kind of thinking like, what are the effects on practice, generally speaking, of that process? I think for someone like you or I, who has a proclivity for doing things like starting theology podcasts, like we're like very comfortable in that mental space, right? We're comfortable with those concepts. We're comfortable and interested in the abstract conversation about those things, right? So we go that way then, I guess. By default, it's like, okay, so that becomes an abstract conversation. But when we are raised in those communities, those kind of distinctives, those theological and otherwise like requirements are linked to the whole thing because they're kind of the thing you have to have in order to do the rest of it. They are the, at least in some churches, they are the in-group, out-group criteria. Is these, these are the things that we affirm on our church's faith statement, page. And if you can't affirm these things, then this is not really the community for you. And then to go, so that's kind of how we're formed when we were younger. And then now to be in this place of like, oh, there's nobody checking, my theological creedal checklist and confirming, not that necessarily happens at many churches, but like, even if I'm doing it myself, I don't have anything I have to live up to. Like I have chosen to go back to our old church for a time before we move because I hadn't found a new one. But if I disagree with them on literally anything, I don't care. Like there's no stakes for what I believe and my church involvement. And similarly, there aren't really any in my own mind. There aren't really any requirements that I've got to hit. And so in that sense, there's tremendous freedom spiritually. And in that sense, I mean, in terms of practice, in terms of my lived spirituality, tremendous freedom. I can go literally any direction with it, but now it's decoupled and it's almost like learning to use a new muscle group or something like that.
Yeah, I think so. Because I think the freedom piece is great in what you were just saying. I've really enjoyed that freedom. Because before, like, I know what it was like to have my livelihood, my paycheck tied to things that I believe, right? And not having that anymore is great. Like, I can say anything, basically anything on the internet, and it's not going to cause, repercussions in the sense of, like, I get fired or something, right?
Right.
Like, I could just be like, yeah, being creedal is boring, and why do I have to do that? And no one's going to care.
Yeah. I've literally been like saying some lines and not other lines recently, and I'm like, it doesn't matter. Right. It's just for myself. I'm just like, I don't really want to say that part out loud. I'll say this part out loud, whatever.
Yeah.
Skipping over the Virgin Mary and the Ascension, things like that.
Yeah, the weird stuff. Yeah. Absolutely. And so, yeah, I wonder too, because I mean, again, to come back to this, and I already mentioned it, but I think the idea that Christianity, at least within maybe more like Western Protestant circles, the idea that Christianity is just this list of like, here's these boxes you have to check. Even if I cognitively know like that is not true, I don't want to reduce my faith to a set of propositions. Maybe that is still something that's so like deeply ingrained in me that it's kind of like that little voice in the back being like, well, Josh, I don't know. Are you actually a Christian? But then when I do something stupid, like, I don't know, I'm going to send you a picture real quick of my surroundings and you're going to laugh at me.
What, I'm going to, should I describe, I'll describe the photo. You're texting me a photo. Is that what you're doing right now while we are on here? Okay.
As I'm sitting here, like asking you the question, am I still a Christian? I'm sending you a picture literally of my desk. And
there's like a Jesus who, okay, let me describe what I'm seeing here. A lot of iconography. We got 3 icons, kind of, you have like a carve out, like you're obviously in like the converted attic or whatever of your house, right?
Yeah.
So you've got kind of a carve out, and above the carve out are 3 like old school icons. Like maybe they all look to be kind of pre 1000 AD. You've got like some kind of a little bit of more psychedelic cosmic-y artwork. You have a Jesus who is sitting cross-legged, much like a Buddha normally is sitting cross-legged. And you got a bunch of theology books, maybe what appears to be kind of like an Orthodox or Byzantine cross. You have like a bowl, like a meditation bowl that you could ding and it will like center you. Oh, there's more books. Okay, that's what I'm seeing. Did I? Yeah. And of course a ring light that's lighting up your face quite nicely. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and so it's funny to me because when I look around, this is like my office. This is where I read a lot. I podcast, and it is filled with like those pictures are like modern day icons of Jesus, like the Franciscan cross. Like the Buddha Jesus as you described, and it's almost like within the Episcopal Church, the one that I've been working at, they're really big on like being immersed in the story. So when you're in their chapel, it's beautiful. It has like all the iconography on the wall. It has like this candle that's always lit that's supposed to symbolize Christ. It has like the big beautiful like altar and all this kind of stuff.
Yeah.
And so like you're surrounded by the Jesus story. Like it's like an embodiment of the faith. And so again,
essentially.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. You're in the story. And so for me, like sitting in my office, it feels like kind of the same thing. And then I have all these books, which is kind of this like the juxtaposition of the knowledge, the information, right?
Right.
The heady stuff. But it's just, I don't know, it's funny to me because I asked myself, am I still Christian? And I've chosen to decorate my office with a bunch of Jesus shit.
It's
basically.
Like very Christian looking. Yeah.
Yes, very much so. Yeah.
But it does seem like kind of there is a mainstream here in terms of like, if we're going to separate out, like what are the different threads of what's kind of causing some friction for you internally, is there's something about the distinction between the abstract, the head knowledge, the systematic theology, the whatever, and then the more lived experience, which I would put like the art, the iconography and the, that statue of a like lotus sitting Jesus. Maybe he's just crisscross applesauce. I'm not sure. But, the seated Jesus and the rose, you have a rosary draped around him. Like, it's beautiful. And it's evocative. And that's kind of an interesting thing about that space. The photo you just sent me is like, that space is a total mishmash of those two things. You've got all the nonverbal, the visual stuff, as you're saying, the like being. When you say be in the story, you kind of mean it like physically, your body and what you are bringing in with your senses, what you are seeing, smelling, hearing, is putting you in the story. And then on the other hand, this abstract stuff, all these books about process theology and evolution and multi-religious identities. And I'm guessing now, I didn't read all the titles, but
you nailed it. I mean, you got the top three things that I've been reading about.
I could have guessed, I could have, if I did Josh Patterson theology family feud, I probably wouldn't get any big X's. I'd get them all right.
No, you crushed it. Yeah. I think, and the living, I don't know. I want to like harp on that lived experience thing, because I want to point to when I do feel most Christian is in those lived experiences. Like when I go to theology beer camp, that's when I feel like, yes, I'm a Christian. These are my people.
These are my people. That you can't understate that part of it. It's not just, well, there's beer here and there's theology here. It's no, these are the people who listen to my podcast, who I interview on my podcast, who I become friends with through this community, that I know we share enough of a view of things. And then that makes me feel, and by the way, I'm speaking for myself just as much as for you here at Theology Beer Camp. And that makes me feel, oh, this is my tribe. Like, these are my peeps. And that's super powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And because then even again, like this weekend, yesterday, I just got home from New Jersey. There's like this God After Deconstruction thing that Tripp and Tom Ord were putting on.
Yeah.
And so I spent time there and really enjoyed it. And again, it was like these people asking the kind of questions that I care about, but also just like living into the reality, right? Of like this, like a community of people where those questions are allowed and celebrated, but also where a lot of the kind of people that I grew up being told like don't belong in churches are in these spaces, It's like deeply moving. And I mean, even to the point where this was an odd experience for me this past weekend, but it ties nicely into this conversation. There was like a breakout session about like deconstruction and podcasting, and people got to ask the panel of us questions. And one of the audience members asked us about essentially our atonement theory. They're like, I want to know what the panelists think about forgiveness. And so like the first guys from a podcast called like Radical Love Live, they said their thing. Tim Whitaker abstained from answering.
From New Evangelicals?
Yeah.
Smart move, Tim.
I went to answer the question, and I couldn't articulate some kind of atonement of forgiveness, but instead I talked about the cross as like the divine revelation of the God who like, chooses to like die rather than kill, God's enemies.
Yeah, be killed instead of kill. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And the God who chooses solidarity with, everybody who, is crucified, like all of these kind of things.
Yeah.
But while I was speaking, I started crying. And like I don't know why, but the beauty of it, I got kind of caught up in it.
Yeah.
And
you were in the story. You could say it that way.
Yeah, it really threw me off. And like, even though I wasn't articulating some kind of like ontological, like courtroom transaction thing, I realized that like the cross, even though I don't think about it much anymore, has deep, significant meaning for me in my life.
Yeah. But it took you kind of having to say it all at once and being surrounded by your people while you were doing it. Right?
Right. Absolutely. So I think that like, I don't know. I feel like the community thing matters.
Well, I think the community thing really does matter, but while we've got a little abstract nugget, let's drill down on that for a minute. Let's get a little theological here. So, what do you think it was about your kind of atonement, cross as a window into God's character? Like, what do you think it was about that answer that got the tears going? Like, was there a particular moment that it really hit you, or do you know now kind of the thrust of that?
Yeah, when I talked with Tripp about it afterwards, what I was trying to describe to him is I felt very emotionally overwhelmed to know that I'm sitting in a room with people who, in this room, I knew there were members of the LGBTQ community present. There were non-white people present, and sitting in a room and saying this surrounded by people whose lived experience this illuminates and impacts was emotionally overwhelming.
Yeah.
Not so much for like, I mean, for me, obviously it matters to me as well, but like that part was overwhelming to me because it was like, wow, this story is like, it matters. And like, I don't, maybe to bring this into it, it's like a privilege thing, right? Like I don't have to think about that as much because I'm not often one who gets crucified in the streets.
No, but that's what's interesting there is the way you're talking about, so atonement questions are, can be the absolute height of pure abstraction, right?
Absolutely.
They can be so disconnected from our lives that, it can be like, I don't know, is it a judicial thing or is it this kind of, in what way does it propitiate? You can get so abstract to where I get like just profoundly uninterested in it because I'm just like, who knows, it's the squiggly line or the straight line. I don't know which one is true. But the fact that you are surrounded by, we might say a great cloud of witnesses if we wanted to go there. But
done.
Actual people, human beings, for whom the way that people answer that question and set up their church communities, set up their theological worlds that they inhabit, has these really strong consequences on people's actual lives. So you're having to answer an abstract theological question surrounded by real people that the answers affect, that drew a connection between these kind of disparate realms we've been talking about, the abstract over here and the concrete and the aesthetic, like the lived experience over here. So is that one way of thinking about why that was powerful?
Yeah, I think so. Actually, I think that's nicely said. Because it did. It took the abstract reality of, Josh sitting at his desk reading some books, trying to figure out what he thinks atonement means, to like, oh, here's the real world implications that this has that impacts actual people and their lives. And I'm like implicated in that as well. Right.
I'll share a story that I will probably end up sharing again on Generation Gap Christian or Culture Hour, rather. Generation Gap, still Christian Hour. So I was in church yesterday morning, and this is our old church that we were involved in for 10 years before we left, and then now we've been back for a little while before we move again. And that church was always complementarian, did not allow women. It was more egalitarian than other churches in its denomination. Like it had deacons, women deacons, and it had been kind of grandfathered in to the denomination, and they still allowed that, even though that wasn't technically allowed in the denomination. And they changed to Anglicanism while we were gone. And so now being back, it's been cool to kind of see some of the differences. I think that the switch to Anglicanism has been entirely positive from my perspective. And one of the things that happened is they recently voted for full inclusion of women. The congregation voted, the staff agreed. And 2 weeks ago, I was there for the first sermon preached by a woman at that church, a church that I had first started attending 15 years ago. Nice. And that was pretty powerful. But then yesterday, on Sunday, we were recording this on a Monday. Yesterday, that woman was ordained as a deacon. And in the Anglican church, being ordained as a deacon is a big deal. It's not like, we just have a deacon's board. Like this is like, a lot of churches where that's really quite a smaller thing. In that church, you have to be a deacon before you can be a priest. So
like deacons like have to go to school and go before like an ordination committee. Well, I'm speaking from like my Episcopal experience.
Yeah, maybe I don't know. So for this Anglican church, I don't know what her educational background was, but there was like a whole process with like people kind of recommending her to it, and the bishop came into town and like did the whole thing. And I found myself tearing up a few times because, again, it was the theoretical becoming practical, just like you were describing in the audience. So our pastor, John Harrelson, gave the homily, and the homily was about being called by God, and he was specifically talking about this woman, Jamie. And he gave three examples from her life that I thought were very powerful. The first was memories that she had, and these were obviously things that they had talked about, and he was kind of putting them on the mic. The first was memories of watching her mom on their kitchen phone, with the long cord, regularly, evening after evening, pastoring other individuals in their church. Now, of course, she was not allowed to be a pastor, but that's what she was actually doing. And that's what Jamie recognized that she was doing. The next was that she was in Awana and excelled. Awana, for those who don't know, is like a parachurch kind of kids Sunday school type of a program, quite conservative, very, very literalist, sword drills and Bible memorization, contests. And it's modeled after the Boy Scouts. So he was talking about these badges that she would get on her Awana vest, right? For Bible memorization and whatever. And then she was a part of some sort of like Bible knowledge team or Bible quiz team. And they were like 4-time like champions. I don't know if it was national champions or state champions or something like that. But it's these moments early in her life where what John was saying was that these were like early moments toward this lifelong call that God had on her to pastor. And now here in this moment, she is being ordained as a deacon, which allows you to preach and I think even maybe even give communion and stuff like that. That's the one thing I'm not sure about. Maybe you don't marry people. I don't know. There's some differences, but it's a significant office in this particular denomination. And so she's, he's telling these stories, and I'm sitting there thinking like, if the folks at Awana knew that she was now basically being ordained as a pastor, they would freak out. They would think that that's unbiblical. But they taught her this stuff, and I talked with John afterward about it, and he's like, yeah, it's kind of like teaching someone jazz chords and then being mad that they started playing jazz. It's like,
right.
you taught me, and now I'm using it. But like that made it real, right? Because it is a justice issue. It is an equality issue. And that issue was made right, in my opinion, in this moment. And it made me quite emotional also just because I'd been involved in this church for so long, and it was emotional to be there for this moment of, I think, a giant step forward. And yeah, so I don't know, that I'm just kind of relating. That experience feels very similar to yours. And again, it's the moments where the abstract becomes practical in some way.
Yeah, I think so. That's a beautiful story. And I think it's cool too, like worth celebrating. I know at least sometimes I'll make this critique of the more progressive circles that I find myself in. There's like a lot of all or nothing thinking that happens a lot, where it's like, oh, if you are not like, you could be like, whatever, check like 3-4 boxes in the progressive world. And they're like, well, are you a vegetarian? You're like, no. Then they're like, well, fuck you. You don't count. And so like, there's this, I don't know. I want to push back against that and say like, it doesn't have to be this all or nothing. Even when we feel really strong about things, right? Like I think women should be able to be pastors. I think gay people should be able to be pastors or whoever, this kind of thing. But when we see these kind of victories that, places are moving towards or like in the direction that we think are appropriate, they should be celebrated, and not cut down because it's like, oh, well, they let women in, but what do they think about this other thing? Like, does that count?
Well, and I had to kind of bracket that because right after her confirmation or ordination, whatever it's called, right afterward, the first announcement that the other pastor made was about Revoice coming to town, which is this like, I can never remember which one's side A and side B Christians, but they are the queer Christians who are celibate and think that that's what God calls them to do. And at an individual level, I'm not going to argue with someone's conscience, but as a movement, I find that to be maybe like a stepping stone for some people, but like not satisfying to me, theologically, psychologically, however you want to say it. I hope that people go beyond that to just being comfortable in their own skin and pursuing romance in the way that they would like to, and feel God's blessing for that. So that I had to kind of go, okay, well, we're not getting all the wins today, but we got one, and we got a huge one. And I think I was able to I had to not do all or nothing there. I had to go, hey, I'll take this. And I'm really grateful to have been here for this. This is really beautiful.
Yeah. And I too, like, I don't know. I don't want to come off as uncharitable because I do think boundaries are important with that in mind, right? Like, I don't think that somebody, so both of my brothers identify within the LGBTQ community. Mm-hmm. They shouldn't have to go to a place where that question is on the table. Like, absolutely not.
I would not go to this church if I were queer. Like, I wouldn't.
Right.
I wouldn't go if my son was queer. I wouldn't go, like I wouldn't take a queer person there, even though they see themselves as very friendly and helpful to, they believe that kind of side B approach or whichever one it is like, that's the biblical and loving way to support queer people. I disagree with that. And I would never take a queer person to a church that wasn't, essentially fully affirming of whatever their sexual or gender identity was. I don't think that churches should be involved in the litigation of that stuff on behalf of God. That's way above our pay grade, and the evidence is lacking anyway.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I'm with you. I just wanted to sneak that in there because
Yeah.
I don't want
so I
it
don't
to come
think-
off as like being a jerk.
No,
I'm just
exactly.
saying, like,
And that's
let's
kind of-
celebrate the little things.
Right,
and
yeah.
still have our boundaries.
Well, I think it's a big thing, and I think that would also be a big thing. I think neither of them are little. And yeah, I mean, I've talked at length about that, of like why I'm comfortable being there for the time being. But also why I probably wouldn't stay as the boys get older in a church like that. And so we'll be exclusively looking for fully affirming churches once we move. But there's, I'm 40 years old. I got 2 kids. There's practicalities, and that's, and that's okay. I know that some listeners disagree with me on that, and that's absolutely their right. But so is this maybe like, are we kind of approaching one of the answers that you were kind of hoping to clarify in talking about this with me? Like, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but the way that I would kind of put these together is something like, maybe you're still Christian in part because the rich theological world of Christianity that you are so drawn to, that you so love to inhabit, it touches the real world in a way that encourages you to celebrate justice, progress, love. I don't know, fill that out however you want.
Yeah, I think so. Or like I don't know. Another way of saying that is like it works, I guess, for me. And it brings about it is a tool that helps me actualize the kind of world that I like, a more beautiful way of being in the world, right?
Yeah.
Like my big thing is like human flourishing. And I want to extend it past that. Like I'm very much into like ecological justice and like I read books about like, what does it mean to have ethics in environmental science? Like these kind of things. So like I'm here for flourishing in general. And Christianity, although not always, has been one of the things that I've seen promote human flourishing in really beautiful and powerful ways. I've seen it unite groups of people for change and for all these kind of things. And so, yeah, I think that's one of the reasons. And maybe that gets at kind of, I know you like to use that metaphor sometimes of like religion is like what, like nuclear fission or something like that.
Nuclear fission, yeah.
Yeah, where it has the ability to do really great stuff or also destroy everything.
Yeah. By virtue of the fact that it just does deal with like the transcendent in people. It just gets at kind of the core, some of the deepest, most profoundly felt parts of being a human being. It's just kind of dealing with the strong stuff, and therefore it can go really good and it can go really bad. That's the short version. Yeah.
Yeah. And
so
in
that sense, Christianity gives a legitimate and workable framework. It's almost like Christianity gives us the right kind of gloves to handle the uranium. If you think about
right,
like,
something like that. Yeah.
The gloves and tongs and all the like protective. I'm thinking of The Simpsons, like when Homer's working in the nuclear reactor. Like it gives us the protective gear and the whatever to like handle this stuff, and we can still mess that up. But like we do at least have, there's a reactor built, and we have the gloves and the goggles, and we do have the water tubes that are cooling it. I don't really understand how nuclear reactors work, and because we've got this uranium and we got to do something with it. And this is a legitimate way of dealing with this uranium and actually getting some flourishing out of it. It's not the only way, in my opinion, to get flourishing out of the uranium, so to speak, but it's a way, and it can be a relatively safe and effective way. Something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. And as someone who is currently writing their master's thesis on religious pluralism,
there you go.
I agree that it's not the only way. And I think that, there are other ways that produce human flourishing. Just it happens to be that the context I was born into is one that is Christianity. Yeah. It's the language that I know and am most familiar with. That's not to say I haven't been influenced by other religious traditions and stuff. Like Buddhism particularly has been helpful for me. I don't think it was in the picture, but like this is also sitting on my desk.
There's also a Buddha, not just a Buddha posture Jesus. You got both.
Yeah. And so and I think I really think story matters. I harp on this a lot on my podcast, Rethinking Faith, and I think the Christian story, or at least the story of Jesus, is a powerful story, especially when it's like shaped around the shit he actually said, or you know what I mean by that, like what we know of what he maybe particularly said through the lens of certain individuals. Like I like the Sermon on the Mount.
Yes, yeah, the Sermon on the Mount's great. Yeah,
and that story is better than a lot of the other stories we can be given, like the capitalism story, where
sure.
Your worth is like whatever you can contribute to society. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Maybe this is like a good final area of inquiry then. I like that you brought up, doing your thesis on religious pluralism. Religious pluralism, something that and listeners know I've been just very open to for a long time now. I've been describing myself as a Christian inclusivist for multiple years. When I need to give a kind of a term for it, like I'm a Christian and also that's not the only game in town, essentially. Mm-hmm. But it works, and it works for me, and it's worked for billions of people. What role, how is learning more about other religions, learning about multiple religious identification, people who identify it in multiple ways, cross-religious dialogue, interfaith dialogue, all that stuff, stewing in all of that, what has that done to the question of why Josh Patterson is still a Christian? Has it had an effect in only one way, in multiple ways? I'm really curious about that.
Yeah, so it's a good question that I haven't really thought about, but it has almost legitimized my wanting to be religious, I guess, because there's so many different religious traditions, and the percentage of people who are involved in a religious tradition over not is very high.
Right. It works for a lot of different kinds of people in all different times and places, something like that.
Yeah, in different times and places. And I know, I've heard you kind of make a positive case for religion before, and how it's like for the average person it seems to be a net positive.
Yeah.
And so that does something. That at least gives me okay, believing in God is not stupid. Because if you want deep personal stuff, the thing that one of the things that I fear the most, and one of the things that makes me the most angry, is when people call me stupid, or I feel like I'm being perceived as stupid. And so that has significant psychological motivation for me.
Well, and there is certainly I don't know how big, but a very loud contingent of in my opinion, pretty reductive atheists, mostly online and sometimes in books and sometimes on the news and stuff, who insist that any kind of religious faithfulness is stupidity, essentially, and is irrationality. And, they're selling a very simple, highly charged, very tribal product to the people who agree with them, which much like fundamentalists are doing for their own tribe. And man, it can feel sometimes like, well, maybe they're right. They're speaking with so much confidence, and then that, if you're sensitive to feeling stupid, then that's gonna touch those, it's gonna have those wires are gonna touch within you and create some sparks. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there's that facet. And then I think another facet is, even though I haven't been practicing as much, I still study mysticism a lot. That's something that I like. And not just within the Christian faith, right? Because there are mystics within various traditions. And even if you don't want to do the word mystic, just people who feel like they have some kind of experiential knowledge of the divine.
Yeah.
Or of the universe or whatever. And that's deeply fascinating to me, because the mystics tend to speak in similar ways. And
Yes.
like most of the mystics end up, they're saying things like, oh, whatever ultimate reality is, it's loving, or it's a positive thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's compelling to me. That's been my experience. And so I want to be able to pull in all of those voices and say, I don't want to do something stupid and be like, oh, well, my Buddhist neighbor who doesn't experience ultimate reality as personal is somehow secretly interacting with like the God that I perceive as personal. Mm-hmm. And so pluralism, it kind of breaks from inclusivism in that regard, but there's different ways that people talk about how that could be. But it legitimizes these experiences, which then in turn I'm like, oh, cool. I find myself wanting to affirm the Buddhist experience, the Muslim experience, the Jewish experience, which then is also like, okay, well, if I can affirm their experiences, why can't I affirm mine? So it like has that kind of.
I love that. Yeah. You're also helping me remember. I haven't talked about this in a while, but yeah, Christian pluralism. That's the one that I liked better than Christian inclusivism, because yeah, oftentimes what people mean by inclusivism is that like everybody is a secret Christian who's not a Christian.
Right.
They just don't
Right.
know it, but like God includes them, Jesus includes them or whatever. And Christian pluralism is like, I am a Christian. I live a Christian life. I believe there are plural paths to God, and this one is a legitimate one. By the way, that's like exactly what I was supposed to be the most afraid of thinking when I was raised evangelical.
Right.
That was like the truest kind of traitor, But the problem is that's just where the evidence has taken me. I don't feel confident arguing against a viewpoint like that for something that is exclusively true to Christianity. I think, yeah, and people are going to probably have follow-up questions about that, because those are murky waters. But I like what you said about, if I want to affirm those experiences, why wouldn't I affirm my own experience? Right. I really like that. I really like that. So in that sense, you're saying, hey, as I look into these different faith traditions and I read these accounts by people in those traditions, I see something in them that I find intriguing, beautiful, leading to flourishing, and I take them seriously. So why can't I apply the same, interest and grace and compassion and whatever to my own experience? I think that's powerful.
Yeah, like if I'm going to be empirical about things, then I have to include all of those.
Yeah,
including my own, which I think is interesting. I think one more facet that has come to mind as we were talking is the land or the realm maybe of like theopoetics or something like that.
I have found myself thinking about this a lot recently. Let me give a quick definition of theopoetics as I understand it. So whereas classic theology is making truth claims about God's nature and the nature of reality, theopoetics is kind of like saying, let's take a step back here. We're not necessarily saying things that are, propositionally true or false. Rather, when we talk in theological language, it is akin to a poet. It is an aesthetic. We are dealing in the realm of beauty, and we are finding beautiful language that maps on to people's experience of faith. So if theology is faith-seeking understanding, well, it is a kind of understanding. It's understanding the experience you had using beautiful language that matches it, as opposed to you've had an experience and now theology is going to help you understand the ultimate reality beyond that experience in different terminology. Is that how you understand theopoetics?
Yeah, I think so. I think that's well said. It's like, because if you were to pick up a poem and read it and then try to go and apply it literally, you'd be missing the point. And so theopoetics helps us get at things that we think maybe are true without speaking in, like, as you were saying, like the realm of like propositions or something like that. And so if that's the case, and we have all these different people having various religious experiences within different religious traditions. And I want to kind of speak to or try to capture those experiences. The language that I have, because of the tradition I grew up in, is Christian. Mm-hmm. And so I can use the Christian language, as like in the realm of theopoetics to describe these experiences in a way that kind of is inviting to people, and also inviting to people of other traditions where our poetics can kind of cross the aisle, if you will, right? Or the borders between the traditions. And that has become more important to me, as some like beauty has been really important to me recently within process thinking, which is where I spend a lot of my time. Value, and so like axiology is the big word, and beauty are huge in process thinking. And so when I think about the intrinsic value of all of creation, and if I believe that the universe, its telos, its goal, is striving for beauty and novelty, then theopoetics makes sense to speak that way, because that's kind of the world that I think I'm in anyway. And the Christian tradition is the tradition that I find myself in, and so I'm going to use that language because it's proven meaningful in my experience, and also it helps me describe that thing, whatever, the value and the beauty of creation and the human experience and whatever.
That's really well said. I'm going to be thinking about that some more. I do, as I said, I find myself coming back to the idea of theopoetics and, the liturgy. A lot of the language of the liturgy is that way. And some people would say, don't start thinking of the Eucharist as, purely poetry. And I think, but maybe it is. And if it is that still something worth engaging in? And I think, sure. Like, why not? Like, anyway, I don't want to go. I feel like I don't have a good enough grasp to follow that trail right now. We'll leave that one dangling. But Josh, thanks so much for insisting that you be here today. I'm glad you did. I think this was a really good conversation. And we'll have a link, obviously, to Rethinking Faith in the show notes if people want to check out your podcast. Anything else to say?
No, I don't think so, Dan. Just thank you, as always, for your friendship and your willingness to entertain my conversation. It was fun.
I appreciate that, and I always enjoy it. So, all right.